The final toll of the convent bells echoed across the hills of Thessaly, a mournful chime swallowed by the biting autumn wind. Olive trees shivered, their ancient leaves trembling as if in fear. Inside their fading chapel, a small band of nuns knelt beneath cracked frescoes, saints with faces long scraped away by centuries of sorrow. On the distant horizon, fire shimmered, a warning signal. Ottoman banners, stark red against the gray sky, already fluttered like sparks across the mountains. The women knew exactly what this meant. No riders came from the nearby towns. No soldiers remained to guard them. Only the heavy, silent stillness before conquered. Their abbess, Sister Eleni of Lissa, stood before the altar, clutching a silver crucifix that had survived 100 years of storms. Her voice was a low whisper, yet it carried through the chapel. "If they breach our walls," she said, her eyes fixed on each sister, "keep your vows inside your hearts, those they cannot take." But she was wrong. When the empire's armies reached the convent gates, vows, prayers, and sanctity meant nothing against the brutal tide of history determined to erase them. The first stones of the convent collapsed before sundown. The hymns that once filled those hallowed halls were drowned out by the clang of iron and the rising screams. The Ottomans wasted no arrows on holy places. They shattered the gates with cannon fire, a deafening roar that was both a warning and a declaration. To them, a convent was not sacred ground. It was a symbol of defiance, proof that the cross still dared to rise on conquered soil. Inside, the sisters desperately hid their relics: silver chalices, intricately embroidered icons, fragments of saint bones tucked beneath the chapel floor. They believed that even if their bodies were lost, their faith might still endure. But the soldiers were not after treasure. They wanted evidence, proof that they had crushed not just the enemy's armies, but their God. By nightfall, the surviving nuns were herded into the courtyard. Torchlight painted their white robes in shifting gold and stark shadow. They were told they would be taken before the Pasha, a promise few ever lived to see fulfilled. What followed became a legend so grim that even church chroniclers avoided its darkest details. By dawn, the convent was ash. Smoke drifted from the refectory, where the women had once shared bread and silence. Ottoman flags now fluttered from the bell tower, signaling nearby units that all resistance was over. Yet, in that courtyard, something unexpected happened. The soldiers, waiting for screams, heard singing instead. Bound with rope, the surviving sisters began to chant a hymn, not of despair, but of unwavering defiance. Agnus Dei, Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. Their voices trembled, yet never broke. The Ottoman captain, unsure whether to laugh or silence them, ordered the abbess dragged forward. Eleni still clutched the silver cross, rescued from the altar. The captain promised her mercy. If she renounced her God and accepted the conqueror's faith, her sisters would live. Her reply sealed her fate. "I have already given my life. What else can you take?" The captain hesitated, perhaps a flicker of something human in his eyes, then turned away, leaving her to his men. What followed was never written in full. Even Ottoman records, which glorified victory, described it only as discipline for those who refused reason. Yet, in later European letters, her name resurfaced: Eleni of Lissa, the nun who would not kneel. By midday, the convent's bells were melted for coin, and the rooftop cross was shipped east as a trophy. But soon, whispers spread across nearby villages. They said that when the wind swept through the ruins at night, one could still hear women's voices, not crying, but praying. The smoke had barely faded when the march began. What remained of the order, 22 women in torn habits, were driven south toward the coast. Their ankles were bound, watched by Ottoman horsemen destined for the heart of the empire. They weren't prisoners of war. They were symbols of conquest, living proof that even sacred walls could fall. The journey was merciless. The sun scorched the road, burning away hope with each painful step. The sisters, who had never stepped beyond their cloister, stumbled from thirst and exhaustion. When one fell, another would carefully lift her veil, ensuring soldiers wouldn't trample it. A final, quiet act of dignity in a world stripped bare of mercy. Their abbess was gone, but her last words endured among them. If you cannot hold the cross, hold each other. After 7 days of grueling walking, the captives reached the port of Volos. Waiting there were Ottoman galleys, ships designed not for comfort, but for absolute control. The women were herded aboard, their wrists shackled to wooden benches where criminals and slaves had once ridden. As the sails caught the wind, the familiar shores of Greece faded into the horizon, and with them, everything they had ever known. The ship's overseer, Yusuf Aga, kept meticulous records: cargo, spices, coins, textiles, and religious captives. It was this very ledger, discovered centuries later in the archives of Istanbul, that confirmed a story once dismissed as mere legend. The voyage to Constantinople lasted 12 days. Storms lashed the deck, waves crashing like giant fists. Salt stung their wounds, hunger hollowed their faces, turning their skin taut and pale. Yet what broke them most wasn't the pain or the hunger, it was the silence. No one spoke to them except to bark commands. They existed like ghosts, floating between sky and sea. At night, the youngest, Sister Magdalena, whispered psalms beneath her breath. Her voice was faint, barely audible over the crashing waves. But even the chained prisoners around her, Greeks, Serbs, and Italians, turned their heads to listen. For a moment, the sea seemed to still its roar. When the ship finally entered the Bosphorus, the sisters saw the skyline of Constantinople rise before them. Its domes and minarets glowed like blades in the dawn, sharp against the nascent light. Across the strait, the city seemed alive, breathing with an overwhelming power. For centuries, it had been called the city of the world's desire. Now, for them, it would become their cage. From the docks, they were paraded through narrow, winding streets, lined with merchants, soldiers, and slaves. Locals paused to stare. Christian nuns among captives were a rare sight, even in an empire built on conquest. They were led past the ancient, imposing walls of Blackernay toward the imperial district, where their fates would be sealed. In the shadow of Hagia Sophia, once the great cathedral of Christendom, they were forced to kneel. As the muezzin's calls echoed from the minarets, one of the sisters whispered, her voice barely a breath, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." From the docks, they were taken into a vast marble courtyard, surrounded by towering columns that seemed to pierce the sky. This was no dungeon. It was the Divan-i Humayun, the imperial council, where the will of the Sultan ruled above all. Here, captives were not judged by kings or priests, but by the raw, unyielding power of the empire itself. For the nuns of Thessaly, their very faith would be measured against the harsh laws of conquest. At the center of the immense hall sat the Grand Vizier, a man whose expression betrayed nothing, his face a mask of stone. To his left, scribes waited with ink and parchment, ready to record every detail, names, ages, and intended uses. Every word would be meticulously entered into registers that still survive centuries later, stained by wax and the passage of time. The sisters stood in their torn habits, eyes lowered, trying to project an air of quiet defiance. Through translators, they were told the Sultan had granted them mercy on one condition. Those who accepted conversion would be given new names, food, and a life within the palace. Those who refused would face the discipline of faith, a chilling phrase that could mean anything from lifelong imprisonment to an unspeakable disappearance. None spoke. Sister Magdalena trembled, her young body a fragile silhouette against the grandeur of the hall. She had seen what happened to other captives brought before the vizier, Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, all swallowed by the empire's impenetrable silence. Before the guards could drag her forward, one of the elders, Sister Deiris, stepped out of line. She addressed the vizier not as a captive, but as someone who had lived long enough to watch empires rise and decay.
"My lord," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her fear, "you may rename us, but you cannot rewrite the prayers we carry within us." The interpreter hesitated, unsure whether to translate such audacious words. When he finally did, the vizier's face remained unreadable. Then he replied coldly, his voice cutting through the vast hall. "Prayers fade when the tongue forgets how to speak them." With a simple, dismissive motion of his hand, the sisters were dismissed. Not to execution, but to the lower chambers of Topkapi Palace, where unclassified captives were capped. Some would call it mercy. Others, later, would call it something far, far worse. Some were given a different kind of prison, one disguised as service. Beneath the sprawling palace gardens lay a labyrinth of cold stone halls, sealed away from the sun's warmth. Each chamber had only a thin slit for light, barely enough to tell night from day. The nuns were stripped of their habits, clothed instead in rough, coarse garments, and told their new purpose was to serve. They would clean floors, sew garments for the elite, and feed the vast fires that warmed the chambers above, but offered no heat to them. It was meant to break them, to turn their holiness into mere servitude, to make their sacred vows seem pathetic in the face of mundane labor. But the Ottomans underestimated them. These were women who had already lived under vows of silence and rigorous denial. Hunger, cold, and profound solitude were nothing new. For them, suffering was not punishment. It was a tangible form of devotion, a path to make their faith real and unyielding. Even in this subterranean prison, their strict discipline became an unbreakable armor. At night, in the oppressive darkness, they prayed in secret. One carved a crude cross into the clay wall with her fingernail, her skin tearing. Another traced verses into the dust beneath her straw bed, a silent testament. They began counting the days by the rhythmic call of the muezzin from above, not out of conversion, but as a defiant internal clock for a faith that refused to die. Soon, whispers spread among the other servants in the palace. There were stories of the silent sisters, foreign women buried deep beneath the palace who never spoke, never begged. Some called them cursed, others, in hushed tones, called them saints. Their silence echoed through the stone tunnels, louder than any prayer. Days bled into months. Their hands blistered from ceaseless labor, washing heavy linens, polishing ornate brass, tending the great fires that gave heat to others, but none to them. Their names were forbidden. Each woman was given a number, a cold mark of ownership. The empire believed that time and hunger, coupled with crushing anonymity, would eventually bend even the strongest faith. That was when the next stage began, a test carefully disguised as mercy. First came kindness. Unexpectedly, nourishing food, fragrant oil, and soft silks were sent to their quarters. Learned men from the palace, serene and gentle, came to speak with them, offering rest, peace, even small freedoms. "Your God and ours are not enemies," one imam said, his voice calm and persuasive. "Take our tongue, and you will be free." But the sisters understood all too well what that freedom truly meant, erasing the very memory of who they were. To forget was the one sin they could not commit, a betrayal of their souls. Sister Magdalena, once the frailest and most trembling among them, now began to rise as their quiet strength. She whispered fragments of scripture remembered from their convent, verses half forgotten, reshaped into prayers that kept their collective spirit alive. Even incomplete, the word endured. When persuasion failed, the masks came off. The torches in their chambers were doused, plunging them into deeper darkness. Their meager food rations were cut in half. There were no more kind visits, only an oppressive silence and deepening gloom. One by one, they were taken to a narrow, desolate room where scribes waited, their quills poised. Each was told to repeat a single phrase of submission, a simple declaration of conversion. Those who did were allowed to live within the palace walls, granted a new, albeit hollow, existence. Those who refused simply disappeared. It wasn't one grand, brutal act of cruelty, but a slow, methodical breaking of the soul. Faith wasn't torn away by force. It was chipped away, little by little, by gnawing hunger, endless waiting, and the quiet, insidious voice asking, "Why suffer for a God who doesn't answer?" A few gave in. 2 sisters from Corfu, twins, finally whispered the words of submission, their voices barely audible. They were dressed in silk, taken away from the shadows, and never seen again by those who remained. For those who stayed behind, each disappearance, each vanishing act only hardened their resolve, transforming grief into an unyielding core of steel. Sister Dieris, once so brave before the Grand Vizier, grew thin and pale, her body wasting away. When guards demanded her name, she smiled faintly, a ghost of her former self. "Call me Silence," she said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. Her defiance, quiet yet potent, spread like a contagion through the remaining women. From that moment, none of them spoke to their captors again. When questioned, they answered only with stillness, an impenetrable, unmoving quietude. And in that stillness, they reclaimed what the empire thought it had taken, control over their own spirits. Official Ottoman records mention them only in passing. Foreign captives, unresponsive, unproductive. To the Ottomans, they were failed conversions, a small blot on an otherwise glorious ledger. To history, however, they became something else entirely. They became living proof that faith could survive where walls and chains could not. By the time spring returned to the palace gardens above, only 11 of the original 22 were still alive. The guards called them ghosts in rags, but the servants whispered of something stranger, that sometimes, deep in the night, faint voices could be heard beneath the palace, chanting in a language no one remembered but everyone instinctively feared. It was the same hymn they had sung as their convent burned. And within those forgotten corridors where no sunlight ever reached, the survivors found something truly unexpected. An old, sealed archway, half buried in dust and ancient stone, its entrance almost completely hidden by debris. At first, the rediscovered archway was merely a hiding place, a small dark haven from their relentless captors. But slowly, inevitably, it transformed into something sacred. They used broken pottery shards for candle holders, carefully salvaged from discarded palace waste. A scrap of linen, perhaps a piece of an old curtain, became their altar cloth, frayed but reverent. From a shard of a shattered mirror, they fashioned a crude yet unmistakable cross. In this secret hidden chapel, they gathered each night after the palace above had finally settled into its uneasy sleep. No hymns, no grand sermons, only whispers. Each woman would kneel, her body aching, and share a memory. A memory of home, of a beloved church bell chiming across the fields, of the warmth of freshly baked bread before dawn, of a mother's lullaby. These memories, precious and fragile, became their new psalms, small, heartfelt offerings to a God who, they believed, still listened in the dark. A Venetian prisoner, held captive in the palace decades later, once wrote cryptically of strange voices echoing from beneath the harem chambers. He spoke of women singing in Latin to a God not of this empire. For centuries, historians dismissed his account as mere superstition, the ramblings of a man broken by captivity. Until, beneath the Topkapi ruins, modern archaeologists uncovered a small hidden chamber. It was lined with faint Christian carvings, silent, undeniable proof that their prayers had never truly stopped. Crosses scratched into the rough stone walls, some barely visible through the grime of ages. A Latin phrase, half erased by time, yet still legible. Lux in tenebris lucet, the light shines in the darkness. That small, profound discovery changed everything. It proved these women had not simply vanished without a trace, as the empire had intended. They had left a mark, a silent revolt etched into the very stones of their prison. Inside their hidden chapel, Sister Magdalena, once the most frail among them, was now the quiet, unwavering center of their faith. She began marking the walls with charcoal, carefully retrieved from the palace fires. Names could not be written openly for fear of discovery, so she devised symbols instead.
A small, soaring bird for each sister still alive, a delicate flame for those who had been lost, swallowed by the palace's silence. Whenever a new bird failed to appear in their secret sanctuary, it meant another had disappeared from their ranks. The guards never uncovered the chapel, never found their hidden sanctuary. Yet they began to notice subtle, unsettling shifts in their captives. Despite the gnawing hunger, the bone-chilling cold, and the relentless confinement, the women moved with a quiet, almost unnatural calm. The overseers labeled it madness, a desperate surrender to their grim fate. But the scribes, who observed them more closely, recorded something else entirely. They had discovered a strength not of this world, a resilience that defied logic. Their secret worship continued for months, perhaps even years, in the suffocating darkness beneath the palace. And though the empire tried with every fiber of its being to erase every trace of their existence, the chapel became their ultimate act of defiance. Not with weapons, not with open protest, but through a faith so deeply ingrained that it refused to die. By the time a new sultan rose to power, only a handful of the sisters remained. They were worn, aged beyond their years, their bodies stooped, almost forgotten by the world above. Yet, beneath the palace, their secret chapel endured, silent, hidden, eternal. Centuries later, when modern excavators explored the sprawling ruins of Constantinople, no one expected that beneath layers of marble and the remnants of a vast empire, the fingerprints of these women would still be there. Women who had prayed in darkness, leaving behind the only thing the conquerors could never claim, their faith carved in stone. By the year 1482, the palace had changed hands again. A new sultan, young and ambitious, ascended the throne with orders to purge any trace of weakness from his predecessor's reign. Every servant, every concubine, every laborer was meticulously recorded in the grand ledgers, except for one curious group. In the Topkapi archives, under columns of names, there was a blank space, a stark, unexplainable gap where 21 entries should have been.
The ledger read, "Unfit for service, disposed." There were no dates, no burial records, no further details whatsoever. This was how history erased them, not with fire and brimstone, but with the chilling, surgical precision of withheld ink. And yet, the very silence surrounding their disappearance became its own powerful proof. Only something truly shameful is hidden with such meticulous care. Centuries later, an Ottoman courtier's diary surfaced in the archives of Bursa, cryptically mentioning foreign women who had refused to submit and disappeared beneath the palace foundations.
Another letter, intercepted by vigilant Venetian spies in the year 1481, spoke of nuns who would not bow to the Sultan's will. Together, these scattered fragments, these accidental whispers from the past, revealed a truth the empire had tried so desperately to bury: the deliberate erasure of women who had become spiritual symbols of an unyielding resistance. The very last record of Sister Magdalena comes from decades later, written by an Italian pilgrim passing through the region. He recounted a story, whispered to him by an elderly palace servant, of a woman who sang to her God until the guard sealed the room. Her name was unknown to the servant, lost to time, but the faint, haunting hymn he described, the pilgrim swore, survived the stone itself. In that distant echo, her story endured. Over time, tales of the vanished sisters became whispered rumors among slaves and servants, passed from mouth to ear in hushed tones. They said that on certain full moon nights, the lower halls of the palace would grow inexplicably cold. The air would smell faintly of incense, though no fire burned. Memory, superstition, or both, the legends simply refused to die. Centuries later, European visitors, drawn to the exotic mysteries of the Ottoman court, heard fragments of the same persistent legend. A French diplomat, writing in the year 1712, noted that among the older palace attendants there persisted a forbidden story of Christian women who had sung themselves into heaven. He dismissed it, with polite incredulity, as mere myth. Yet, the walls themselves had already told the truth. The chapel lies in ruins now, its purpose long forgotten by most, but the carvings remain. Faded prayers, etched into the rough stone walls, a silent whisper of women who refuse to be forgotten. In their stillness, they still speak. And if you've heard their story tonight, let it stay with you, a quiet ember in the darkness. Leave a comment. Tell us what you felt when you learned what they endured, a testament to the human spirit's boundless capacity for resilience. And if you want more untold stories buried in the deep shadows of history, subscribe and step deeper into the darkness with us. Because some truths deserve to be remembered, no matter how much they were originally meant to be